They said these cases would never be solved. Some of them were so old, so cold, so buried under decades of silence and dead ends that the detectives who first worked them had long since retired, grown old themselves, or passed away without ever seeing justice. Some of the victims had been lying in unmarked graves, stripped of their names, reduced to nothing more than a number in a database, a Jane Doe, a John Doe, a case file collecting dust in the back of a storage room somewhere. Some of the families had spent literally half a century waiting by the phone, hoping someone, somewhere, would finally call with an answer. And for a long time, nobody did. But here is the thing about justice. Here is the thing that every detective who has ever refused to close a cold case file understands on a bone-deep level. DNA does not forget. Evidence does not lie. And time, as it turns out, is not always the enemy of truth. Sometimes, time is exactly what a case needs. Because the science catches up, the technology advances, the databases grow larger, and suddenly, a speck of biological material so small you cannot see it with the naked eye, a fragment of genetic code preserved in a piece of evidence that has been sitting in an evidence locker for 30, 40, 50, even 60 years, suddenly becomes the key that unlocks everything. In 2026, 7 cases that once seemed impossible to solve were cracked wide open. 7 families who had been living in that unbearable limbo between grief and hope, that terrible space where you never fully mourn because you never fully know, finally got the answers they had been waiting for. Some of them had been waiting for over 6 decades. Some of them had already buried parents who went to their graves without ever knowing what happened to the person they lost. And some of those answers, when they finally came, were almost too painful to bear, because knowing the truth means knowing the details, knowing the horror, knowing the last minutes and the last seconds of someone you loved. But closure, even painful closure, is still closure. These are 7 cold cases that were solved in 2026. And the stories behind them are more haunting, more heartbreaking, and more extraordinary than anything you could write in a crime novel. Let's start from the beginning. Case 1. The Ventura County Jane Doe, Maricela Rocha Para The Discovery. It was a July morning in 1980. The kind of warm, sun-drenched Southern California morning that feels like it belongs in a postcard. A maintenance worker arriving early at Westlake High School in Thousand Oaks, Ventura County, California, was going about his routine when he found something in the parking lot that would haunt him and the entire community for the next 4.5 decades. A woman, young, partially clothed in a white top, red pants, and black high-heeled sandals. Lifeless. The Ventura County Sheriff's Office was called immediately. Investigators arrived and began piecing together what little information the scene could offer. The woman had been stabbed in the chest. She had been sexually assaulted. And the evidence at the scene made one thing very clear. She had not died there. Someone had ended her life somewhere else and then transported her body to that parking lot, dumping her there like she was nothing. Like she was nobody. And for the next 4 to 5 years, to the outside world, that is tragically, heartbreakingly exactly what she remained. Nobody. A name on no list. A face on no missing persons report. A mystery that the best investigators in Ventura County could not crack. But the detail that made this case even more devastating was discovered during the autopsy. The Ventura County Medical Examiner's Office determined that this young woman, this Jane Doe found discarded in a high school parking lot on a warm July morning, was pregnant when she was killed. She was carrying a child. And someone took both of their lives. The investigation stalls. For 3 full decades, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office could not identify the woman. Think about what that means for a moment. 3 decades. 30 years. An entire generation of investigators worked this case and could not put a name to this woman's face. They had evidence. They had a body. They had a crime scene. But without a name, without a family connection, without anyone coming forward to say they recognized her, the case went nowhere. The identity of her killer was just as elusive. No witnesses. No clear motive. Nothing. Then in 2011, DNA technology had advanced to a level that finally gave investigators something to work with. The Ventura County Sheriff's Office used evidence that had been carefully preserved from the original scene to develop a DNA profile of Jane Doe's perpetrator. It was a critical breakthrough, even if they did not yet know who that perpetrator was. They submitted the profile. They waited. 2 years later, in 2013, they got a hit. The FBI's combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, matched the profile to a man named Wilson Chuist. And when investigators pulled Chuist's file, What they found painted the picture of a violent predator who had been operating in California in the summer and fall of 1980. At the time of the DNA match, Chuist was already behind bars. He was incarcerated in the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, serving a life sentence for a previous conviction that included robbery, kidnapping, and sexual assault. The crimes he had been convicted for took place in September 1980, just 1 month after the Ventura County Jane Doe was murdered. The pattern was unmistakable. Chuist was arrested in connection with the Ventura County Jane Doe case in 2015. He was tried, found guilty, and handed another life sentence without the possibility of parole. Justice, at least in terms of prosecuting her killer, had been served. But there was still one piece missing. One enormous, devastating piece. Nobody knew who she was. The DNA Doe project takes over. In 2018, the Ventura County Sheriff's Office presented the Jane Doe case to the DNA Doe Project, a non-profit organization that uses forensic genetic genealogy to identify unknown individuals. The science behind what they do is genuinely remarkable. By analyzing the DNA of an unidentified person and running it against genealogical databases filled with voluntary submissions from ordinary people doing ancestry tests, forensic genealogists can build out family trees, trace distant relatives, and eventually work their way to an identification that traditional law enforcement methods simply cannot achieve. But even by the DNA Doe Project standards, this case was exceptional in its difficulty. A statement from the project described it as the largest and most labor-intensive endeavor in the history of the DNA Doe Project. Think about what that means. This organization has worked hundreds of cases, hundreds of unidentified individuals. And this woman found in a California parking lot in 1980, was the hardest one they had ever encountered. With only distant DNA matches and almost no public records to work with, a team of investigators and volunteers spent 7 years painstakingly building out the family tree. 7 years of work. Of dead ends and new leads and breakthrough moments and more dead ends. They traced her lineage back through generations, crossing borders, working with records from multiple countries, until they eventually identified a couple from Zacatecas, Mexico, who were likely her great-grandparents. That was the thread they needed. Following that thread, the investigators kept pulling, kept building, kept searching. And then, on December 9, 2025, a moment that changed everything. The breakthrough. Investigators made contact with one of the great-grandchildren of the couple from Zacatecas. In the course of that conversation, the man shared something that stopped the investigators cold. His sister had been missing since 1980. Her name was Maricela Rocha Parra, and she had disappeared the same year that Ventura County Jane Doe was found in that high school parking lot. The man told investigators that after Maricela's disappearance, her siblings had spent years looking for her. Years of searching with no answers. No resolution. No closure. Just silence where a person used to be. The investigators moved quickly. They spoke with 2 of Maricela's siblings, who flew to California and provided DNA samples. Those samples were compared against the DNA profile of Ventura County Jane Doe. The match was confirmed. In January 2026, more than 4 to 5 years after her body was found, more than 10 years after her killer was convicted, Ventura County Jane Doe was officially and positively identified as 22-year-old Maricela Rocha Parra. Who was Maricela? She was not just a Jane Doe. She was not just a case file. She was a young woman with a whole life ahead of her. She was born in Mexico but had made her way to Los Angeles, building a new life for herself with the kind of determination and quiet courage that her family clearly recognized in her. She was a waitress working in downtown Los Angeles. She was studying to become a nurse. She had plans and ambitions and a future she was working toward every single day. She had a 2-year-old daughter waiting at home for her. She was 4 or 5 months pregnant with another child. And on the day she disappeared, she was supposed to show up at her 10-year-old sister's birthday party. With a cake. That was the plan. That was the last thing anyone expected of her. Show up with a cake. Celebrate a birthday. Be a sister. She never arrived. Her family described her as a deeply loving person who always looked out for the people around her. Someone who cared. Someone who showed up. Until the day that someone made sure she could never show up again. One of her older sisters never stopped hoping. For more than 50 years, that sister lived in the same house, in the same place, holding on to the possibility that one day Maricela might come home. She never did. But at least now, finally, she has a name again. The family speaks. At a news conference, Maricella's siblings Alma Braden and Ronaldo Rocha spoke publicly about what this resolution meant to them. Alma, her voice heavy with the complexity of emotions that only someone who has lived through this kind of loss can truly understand, spoke about the experience of finally learning the truth. She described the journey as having to confront details that you almost do not want to know. Because knowing the truth means knowing what happened. And knowing what happened means your mind goes to that place. The last minutes. The last seconds. That movie, she said, plays in your head over and over. Ronaldo spoke about their mother. When their mother was in her final days, lying on her deathbed, she kept saying Maricella's name. Even at the very end, she could not let go. She carried that grief, that not knowing, all the way to her last breath. Ronaldo said they knew how much it was hurting her right up until that last day. But now, finally, they have closure. They can begin the healing process. Wilson Chuist, now 75 years old, remains incarcerated at Corcoran State Prison, serving out his life sentence. He will die behind bars. And Maricela Rocha Parra, the young woman who was taken from her family at 22 years old, carrying a child, with a toddler daughter at home and a nursing career in front of her, finally has her name back. After 4 to 5 years, she is no longer a Jane Doe. She is Maricela. She was loved. And she will be remembered. Case TWO, Mary Simpson, the oldest cold case ever solved with DNA 61 years of silence. Before we get into the details of this case, you need to understand the context of what we are talking about when we say this is the oldest cold case ever solved using DNA evidence. We are talking about a crime that took place in 1964. When this crime happened, the Beatles had just released their first album. The Civil Rights Act had just been signed into law. The Vietnam War was just beginning to escalate. DNA profiling as a forensic tool would not even be invented for another 20 years. And yet, 61 years later, the man responsible for the murder of 12-year-old Mary Simpson was identified, confirmed, and officially named. Not a suspect. Confirmed. Proven beyond any reasonable scientific doubt. That is the power of what DNA technology has become. The night Mary disappeared. March 15, 1964. Elmira, New York. A Sunday evening. 12-year-old Mary Simpson had spent part of the afternoon visiting relatives. Around 6:30 in the evening, she set off to walk home, passing near East Market and Harriet Streets in Elmira. It was an ordinary walk. The kind of walk a kid takes 100 times. Through a neighborhood. Down familiar streets. Home for dinner. She never made it. When Mary failed to return home, her father reported her missing that same evening. And then the waiting began. That unbearable, terrifying waiting that families of missing children know too well. 4 days later, on March 19th, a man out hiking with his sons in a wooded area about 7 miles from Mary's home near Corning Hill Road in Southport made a discovery that shattered any remaining hope. He found Mary's body. She had been partially concealed beneath debris and large stones, hidden away in the woods as if someone had tried to erase the evidence of what they had done. The medical examination revealed the full horror of what had been done to this 12-year-old girl. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. And in what investigators described as a detail of particular brutality, her mouth had been stuffed with twigs and dirt. She died of asphyxiation. The case sent shockwaves through Elmira. This was a small, close-knit community, and the idea that someone had done this, that someone capable of this was walking among them, created a fear that settled deep into the community's bones. Decades of dead ends. The police conducted hundreds of interviews in the years and decades that followed. Hundreds. They pursued every lead they could find. They worked the case as hard as the forensic science of the era allowed them to. It was not enough. The case went cold. In 2003, nearly 40 years after the murder, investigators achieved something that had not been possible before. DNA found on Mary's skirt, male DNA, was extracted and entered into a national DNA database. It was a moment of genuine hope after 4 decades of silence. But there were no matches. They tried again in 2014. Resubmitted the profile. Cast the net wider. Still nothing. The science was advancing but had not yet caught up to this case. The nanogram that changed everything. Then, in 2022, Elmira Police Sergeant William Goodwin was awarded a grant that opened a new door. The grant funded advanced DNA testing, and Goodwin worked with FBI Special Agent Kenneth Jensen to take the next step. Jensen took the DNA sample, what was described as just 0.4 nanograms of biological material, a quantity so small that it was almost invisible to the naked eye, and shipped it to Parabon Nanolabs for forensic DNA analysis. Think about that for a moment. Less than half a nanogram of genetic material, preserved for nearly 60 years, collected from the skirt of a 12-year-old girl who was murdered in 1964. That impossibly tiny sample was about to break a case that had stumped investigators for over half a century. Parabon uploaded the profile into 2 public DNA databases, and the FBI used investigative genetic genealogy to begin building family trees from the matches that came back. After painstaking analysis and research, the genealogical work pointed toward a single individual. A son came forward and submitted a DNA sample. That sample pointed directly to his father, Raymond Murray. Raymond Murray was a United States Army veteran who had served during the Korean War. He was a truck driver. He had lived and raised a family in Elmira, the same city where Mary Simpson had lived and died. He had 3 children and 2 grandchildren. By all outward appearances, a man embedded in ordinary community life. But dig a little deeper, and a very different picture emerges. Old news reports, the kind that investigators know to comb through when building a case, revealed that Murray had a documented history of criminal behavior involving children. Specifically, he had been arrested on charges of molesting 2 7-year-old sisters, a crime he committed when he was just 17 years old. The records were there. The pattern was there. It had been there all along. Raymond Murray passed away at the age of 72 of natural causes. He was buried in Elmira. He had spent his entire life in the same city where he had committed his worst crime, living among the community he had terrorized, raising a family, dying peacefully in his bed. While Mary Simpson's family spent 61 years waiting for justice, Raymond Murray died without ever being held accountable. But death, as it turns out, is not necessarily the end of accountability. The exhumation. By this point in the investigation, FBI agent Jensen had retired from the Bureau and was working for the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children as a forensic case manager. He reached out to Sergeant Goodwin with a suggestion that would prove decisive. He told Goodwin that NCMEC could help with the next step. NCMEC provided both the funding and the expertise of a forensic anthropologist. At the end of 2025, they exhumed Raymond Murray's remains from his grave in Elmira. It was an emotional moment. Dozens of officers, many of them retired, many of them carrying decades of personal investment in this case, showed up to witness it. People who had spent careers trying to solve this case, who had never let it go, who had kept coming back to it year after year. They stood together and watched as the remains were recovered. In February 2026, the laboratory results came back. DNA confirmed that Raymond Murray, who had been 33 years old when he murdered 12-year-old Mary Simpson in 1964, was responsible for her death. The oldest cold case ever solved with DNA evidence had finally been closed. A sister's grief. Mary's sister, Linda Galpin, was 78 years old when she received the news, and she described the resolution as bittersweet. How could it be anything else? She has thought about her little sister every single day for 61 years. Every single day. She was 16 when Mary was taken. They had grown up together in that close, ordinary way that sisters do in small communities in the 1960s, playing kick the can with the neighborhood kids, skating up and down the street on metal wheels that clamped to the soles of their shoes, the kind of skates you tightened with a special key. Ordinary childhood things. The kind of memories that feel like they belong to a different world. Linda had been out of town when the crime took place, and she had been haunted in the decades since by the memory of seeing her beloved sister's body at the funeral. That image never left her. It stays with you. The face. The stillness. The understanding that your childhood, and Mary's entire future, ended in that single terrible moment. Raymond Murray is dead. He will never stand trial. He will never sit across from a jury and be forced to look at the face of the family he destroyed. He died comfortably, which is not the justice that Mary Simpson deserved. But the truth is known now. Mary Simpson's case is officially closed. Her name is cleared of the word unsolved. And after 61 years, her sister can say, we know what happened. We know who did it. We know his name. That is something. After 61 years of nothing, that is everything. Case 3, Sarah Gear, the cigarette that convicted a Killea Cloverdale, 1982. The small town of Cloverdale sits in Sonoma County in Northern California, the kind of place where everybody knows their neighbors, where children can walk downtown on a summer evening without their parents worrying. Or at least, it felt that way before the evening of May 23, 1982. That evening, 13-year-old Sarah Gear left her friend's house to walk downtown. It was a simple trip. The kind of errand a teenager makes without a second thought. She was nearly there when someone accosted her near an alley off a residential street. A firefighter walking home from work early the next morning discovered her body. She had been dragged down that alley to a secluded area near an apartment building, behind a fence, out of sight. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled with her own shorts. Sarah Gear was 13 years old. The investigators ruled it a homicide immediately. But with the limited forensic science available in 1982, no suspect was identified. Despite everything investigators had to work with, the case went cold. Cloverdale was changed forever, and Sarah's family was left with nothing. The 2003 breakthrough that led nowhere. 2 decades passed. Then, in 2003, a breakthrough. A criminalist with the California Department of Justice developed a male DNA profile from evidence collected from Sarah's underwear. It was an enormous leap forward for a case that had been sitting without answers for 20 years. But the profile did not match anyone in law enforcement databases at the time. And so the case remained unsolved. Another 2 decades crawled by, another generation of investigators cycled through, and still, the man who had murdered Sarah Gear in 1982 walked free. The investigation was formally reopened in July 2021. This time, investigators employed a technique that had been transforming cold case investigations across the country, investigative genetic genealogy. Using the same general approach that had cracked so many other seemingly impossible cases, the genetic genealogy work narrowed the DNA source down to one of 4 brothers with the last name Unique. 4 suspects. All brothers. The investigators needed to figure out which one. The cigarette. Here is where the story takes a turn that feels almost cinematic. The FBI conducted surveillance on the suspect they were focusing on. They watched him. They waited. And then James Oliver Unique discarded a cigarette he had been smoking. Investigators collected it. A DNA analysis of that cigarette confirmed that James Unique's DNA matched the 2003 profile that had been developed from evidence collected from Sarah Gear's clothing on the day she was murdered. 4 to 2 years after the crime, a discarded cigarette solved a murder. James Unique was arrested in July 2024 at his home in Willows, California. He was charged with murder, sexual assault, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts with a minor under 14 years old by force. The trial. Unique's trial began in January 2026, 4 to 4 years after he committed the crime. The jurors heard testimony from Sarah's friends who had spent time with her in that final weekend when she was still alive, before the evening of May 23, 1982, when everything ended. Sonoma County District Attorney Carla Rodriguez described this as the coldest case ever presented to a Sonoma County jury. And sitting in that courtroom, 66-year-old James Unique testified in his own defense. He claimed that Sarah, 13-year-old Sarah Gear, had propositioned him at a Cloverdale arcade. He claimed they had consensual intercourse near the Russian River. He suggested that afterward, someone else had attacked her. He sat there, in front of a jury, and said that a 13-year-old girl had initiated the encounter. He looked at Sarah's family, at her friends who had testified about her final days, and he said that someone else had done it. After roughly 2 hours of deliberations, the jury rejected his account completely and returned a guilty verdict. James Unique is looking at life in prison without the possibility of parole. He is scheduled to be sentenced on April 23, 2026. District Attorney Rodriguez said in her statement, "This guilty verdict is a testament to everyone who never gave up searching for Sarah's killer. While 4 to 4 years is too long to wait, justice has finally been served." 4 to 4 years. Sarah Gear was 13. She would be 57 now if she had been allowed to live. Instead, her story ended in an alley in Cloverdale on a May evening in 1982. But at least now, it ends with justice. Case 4, Elizabeth W.S.O.N., the friendly Avon Ladia grandmother. A widow. A victim. In the neighborhood where she lived in Washington County, Oregon, Elizabeth W.S. was known simply and warmly as the friendly Avon lady. She was 82 years old. She was the widow of a pastor. She was a grandmother. She spent her time helping others in her community. She was the kind of person who makes a neighborhood feel like a neighborhood. On September 23, 1992, friends and family became concerned when they could not reach her. When authorities entered her home, they found a scene that no words can adequately describe. Elizabeth had been fatally stabbed and strangled in her own home. She was 82 years old. Stabbed and strangled. In her home. There were no immediate suspects. The investigators collected physical evidence, but DNA technology in the early 1990s was still limited enough that the evidence gathered offered few actionable leads. For decades, Elizabeth W.'s case sat among the unsolved files of Washington County. The detectives always suspected one particular man. They had a name. They had a hunch. They had pattern recognition built on years of working violent crimes in the region. But they did not have enough evidence to charge him. And so Elizabeth's case, like so many others, went cold. Caesar Barron, a monster in plain sight. To understand the full scope of what was eventually confirmed in this case, you have to understand who Caesar Barron was. And the story of Caesar Barron is the kind of story that forces you to grapple with how someone becomes a predator of this magnitude. Barron was born in December 1960 under the name Adolph James R. Jr. His early childhood was a cascade of trauma. When he was 4 years old, his mother left the household. His parents divorced. He was raised by his father and his father's new wife. By multiple accounts, his father was extraordinarily abusive, both physically and emotionally, beating him frequently and humiliating him on a regular basis. Barron himself later claimed that he had also suffered sexual abuse as a child. By the time he was between 6 and 12 years old, his behavior was already alarming. He threatened other children with knives. He tried to burn other kids' eyes with cigarettes. He stole regularly. He displayed a disturbing fixation on violence against animals, later claiming he had once nursed a monkey back to health and then locked it in a closet with stray cats to watch what would happen. Whether that story is true or fabricated, it reveals something deeply troubling about how this man related to living creatures. At 17, he attempted to sexually assault his stepmother. She managed to escape. He was placed in a juvenile detention facility for 2 years for burglary. People who knew him during his teenage years described him as quick-tempered, manipulative, and unpredictable. He began using drugs and alcohol, which predictably made everything worse. As an adult, Barron drifted. He moved frequently. He could not hold jobs. He accumulated arrests for robbery, assault, and increasingly violent crimes. At one point in his life, he shared a prison cell at Florida State Prison with Ted Bundy. That is not a coincidence of character. That is a pattern. After being released from prison in 1987, Barron eventually made his way to the Pacific Northwest. In late 1988, he somehow managed to enlist in the United States Army, convincing recruiters that he had completed 2 years of college at Indian River State College. He completed basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, and was transferred to Fort Lewis, Washington, where he joined the 75th Ranger Regiment's B Company, 2nd Battalion. In December 1989, his battalion was deployed to Panama as part of the operation to overthrow the Noriega government. After his military discharge, Barron settled in Hillsboro, Oregon. He worked occasionally as a cabinet maker and briefly as a nursing assistant at a care home in Forest Grove. He had multiple short-lived relationships and marriages. He had periods of homelessness. He was charming, by all accounts, at first glance. The kind of person who could disarm you, who could make you feel comfortable, who could gain your trust before you understood what you were really dealing with. And during the late 1980s and early 1990s in Hillsboro, the women of that community paid the price for that charm. A pattern of terror. The investigators who eventually pieced together Barron's crimes identified clear patterns in how he operated. He targeted women who were alone. Many of his crimes involved sexual violence. He broke into homes or ambushed victims in public spaces. And he lived close to his victims' neighborhoods, hiding in plain sight among the people he was hunting. His first confirmed victim was 61-year-old Margaret Helen Schmidt. In April 1991, Barron broke into her home on Southeast Walnut Street in Hillsboro, strangled her, stole money, and left. Her body was discovered by a social worker. Robbery was initially believed to be the primary motive. It was not. In September 1992, just weeks before Elizabeth W.S. was murdered, Barron attacked 41-year-old Martha Bryant. Martha was a midwife. She was driving home from work when Barron targeted her. He shot into her car. He dragged her from the vehicle. He sexually assaulted her. And then he shot her in the head. Her body was found on a road in Hillsboro, and she was airlifted to a hospital in Portland where she was pronounced dead. Elizabeth W.S. was murdered in late September 1992, a crime that investigators now know was committed by Barron despite having lacked the forensic proof for 33 years. In December 1992, Barron and an acquaintance picked up 23-year-old Shantae Alice Woodman outside a nightclub. She was kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and when she fought back, Barron shot her in the head. Her body was later dumped along a highway. On January 7, 1993, Barron broke into the apartment of 51-year-old Betty Lou Williams in Cornelius, Oregon. During the sexual assault, Williams suffered a heart attack and died. 3 additional women survived Barron's attacks and later testified against him, helping investigators build a comprehensive picture of his method and pattern. When Barron was finally arrested and convicted in 1995, the community of Hillsborough breathed for what felt like the first time in years. He was convicted of 4 murders and received the death penalty. He was also linked to multiple sexual assaults. But Elizabeth W.'s case was not among those 4 convictions. Despite the detective's suspicion, the forensic evidence simply was not strong enough at the time. In 2009, Caesar Barron died in prison while awaiting execution. He took what investigators believed were several more secrets with him. 2026, the answer finally comes. In 2023, a detective with the Hillsborough Police Department named Megan Townsend pulled Elizabeth W.'s case back out of the cold files and re-examined the evidence. Physical evidence collected from the crime scene in 1992 was submitted to the Oregon State Police Forensic Laboratory for modern DNA testing. And in February 2026, the results came back. Male DNA on the evidence conclusively linked Caesar Barron to Elizabeth's murder. Detective Townsend said, "For years, this family lived without answers. Today, we are finally able to give them the truth they deserved from the beginning. Our thoughts remain with them, and we honor the life of Elizabeth W.S. by ensuring this case is no longer left in silence." Barron had been dead for 17 years. There would never be a trial. He had escaped the courtroom, but he had not escaped the science. The answer came 33 years after the crime, but it came. Elizabeth W.'s family was notified and expressed relief. They have requested privacy, which is completely understandable. After 33 years, the gentle, community-minded woman known as the friendly Avon Lady has finally been given the truth she deserved. Case 5, Mary Simpson, an addendum on the weight of justice. We covered Mary Simpson's case earlier in this video. But there is something worth pausing on here that goes beyond the forensic details and timeline. Something about what justice means when the perpetrator is already dead. Raymond Murray lived to 72. He outlived the crime by decades. He built a life, raised a family, attended community events, moved through the world as a free man while Mary Simpson's family mourned her for 61 years. Is that justice? Can you call it justice when the man responsible never faces a courtroom, never looks at the family he destroyed across a room, never hears a judge pronounce sentence, never spends a day in prison specifically for what he did to that little girl? These are questions that Mary's sister Linda carries with her at 78 years old. "It is bittersweet," she said. That word carries so much. Bitter for what can never be recovered, for the trial that will never happen, for the fear and the grief and the 61 years of not knowing. Sweet for the fact that the truth is finally known, that her sister is no longer the victim of an unsolved crime, that someone can now say his name and point to the grave and say, "This is the man who did it." The oldest cold case ever solved with DNA deserves to be sat with for a moment. Not just for what it says about the incredible capability of modern forensic science, but for what it says about the patience of grief and the endurance of a family that never stopped wanting the truth, even when the truth took 61 years to arrive. Case 6, the Palatka John Doe, Patrick Nordana body in the woods. On October 8, 1981, in the wooded landscape of Putnam County, Florida, a discovery was made about 30 feet from the old San Mateo Road near Palatka. Skeletal human remains. Unidentified. Male. White. Estimated age under 60. Height estimated between 5 feet 5 inches and 6 feet. Weight estimated between 200 and 250 pounds. The Putnam County Sheriff's Office responded. They gathered evidence. They investigated. The body was in an advanced state of decomposition. The face was entirely unrecognizable. There was no clothing on the remains. About 20 feet away, a pair of size 40 underwear was found. Critically, there were no signs of foul play. No tracks leading to or from the body. The death was ruled as resulting from undetermined nonviolent causes. Whatever had happened to this man, investigators did not believe it was a crime. But the mystery of who he was remained completely unsolved. No one matching his description had been reported missing. No family came forward. No identification was possible with the technology available in 1981. The man was given a name that was not his name. They called him Palatka John Doe. He was buried in a pauper's grave in Palatka's Oak Hill Cemetery. His details were entered into the National Missing and Unidentified Persons System, and for the next 4 decades, he lay in that grave, unnamed and unclaimed. The modern investigation. In December 2023, more than 42 years after his remains were discovered, the body of Palatka Jane Doe was exhumed. Forensic evidence was gathered and submitted to Parabon Nanolabs in March 2024 to determine whether advanced DNA testing could shed light on who this man had been. The scientists at Parabon successfully developed a DNA extract from the provided evidence. They then used forensic-grade genome sequencing to build a comprehensive DNA profile for the unidentified man. Parabon's forensic genetic genealogy team uploaded that profile into forensic databases and conducted a genealogical search, developing new investigative leads that were turned over to law enforcement. Working from those leads, investigators identified potential relatives of Palatka Jane Doe. Reference DNA samples were collected from one relative, and in February 2026, those samples were compared to the Jane Doe's DNA profile using Parabon's kinship analysis technology. The comparison confirmed it. Palatka Jane Doe was Patrick Nordan. Who was Patrick Nordan? Patrick Nordan would have been 39 years old at the time of his death. He was born in Erie, Pennsylvania in March or April of 1942. His life had been shaped by hardship from its very beginning. Due to family difficulties, Patrick and his siblings were placed for adoption through St. Joseph's Orphan Asylum for Boys in Erie. A sibling who spoke with the sheriff's office believed that Patrick had been adopted around the age of 4. The investigators found no evidence that any of his siblings were adopted together. They were separated, as children, into different families, into different lives. And somewhere along the way, Patrick Nordan ended up in Putnam County, Florida, alone, unclothed, and unidentified, and for 42 years, the world did not know his name. The investigators do not yet know how Patrick came to be in that wooded area near Palatka. His post-adoption name and his adoptive family are still unknown. There are still pieces of this story that remain missing. The sheriff's office continues to search for Patrick's adoptive family, both to return his remains for a proper burial and to understand the full story of his life and his final days. But the missing person case is solved. After 42 years, Patrick Nordan has his name back. If you have any information about Patrick Nordan or the circumstances around how his remains came to be found in Palatka, Florida in October 1981, the Putnam County Sheriff's Office is asking for your help. Case 7. The woman behind the STATSTICS. Why these cases matter. We have covered 6 extraordinary cold case resolutions in this video. 6 victims. 6 families. 6 investigations that stretched across decades and in some cases pushed the boundaries of what forensic science can do. But before we close, there is something that needs to be said that transcends any individual case. These are not just interesting crime stories. They are not just testament to the power of DNA technology, although they absolutely are that. They are something more fundamental than that. They are a reminder of what happens to the humanity of a victim when a case goes cold. When a case goes unsolved, when the investigation stalls and the years turn into decades, the victim risks becoming only a file, only a reference number, only a Jane Doe or a Jane Doe in a database somewhere, stripped of their name, their story, their relationships, their loves, their dreams, their plans, the specific irreplaceable texture of who they were. Marisela Rocha Parra was not just Ventura County Jane Doe. She was a woman who was working 2 jobs in Los Angeles, waiting tables and studying nursing, raising a 2-year-old daughter, carrying another child. She was the sister who was supposed to show up to a birthday party with a cake. She was the daughter whose name her mother whispered on her deathbed 50 years later. She was someone who had a whole life, and someone took that life, and the world almost forgot her name entirely. Mary Simpson was not just an old cold case from 1964. She was a 12-year-old girl who skated down neighborhood streets with her 16-year-old sister on metal wheels clamped to her shoes. She was a child who deserved to grow up. She deserved to be 70 years old, looking back on a long life. Instead, she became, for 61 years, a case that nobody could close. Sarah Gear was not just Sonoma County case number whatever. She was a 13-year-old kid walking to downtown Cloverdale on a warm May evening, the same way kids have done in small towns forever. She deserved to be 57 years old. She deserved to have a story that went further than May 23, 1982. And Elizabeth W.S. was not just a cold case from Washington County. She was the friendly Avon lady. She was a grandmother. She was a pastor's widow who spent her days helping her community. She deserved to die peacefully in that home, Not to have her life ended violently by a predator who then moved on to his next victim as if she had never mattered. The Ventura County Sheriff's Office said something in their statement about the Maricela Rocha Parra case that deserves to be quoted here, and it applies to every single case in this video. These types of cases are not just about solving a case for those involved. It is about giving a name back to the victim who deserves to be remembered and bringing closure to the families that have been searching for answers. Giving a name back. That is what this is about. The science is remarkable. The investigative work is extraordinary. The perseverance of the detectives and forensic genealogists and laboratory scientists who spend years, sometimes careers, working these cases is genuinely humbling. But underneath all of that, at the very center of everything, is the name. The specific, individual, irreplaceable name of a person who was loved, who is missed, and who deserves to be remembered. In 2026, 7 of those names were given back. The technology that is changing everything. It would be impossible to discuss these cases without pausing to acknowledge just how transformative the convergence of modern DNA technology and forensic genetic genealogy has been for cold case investigations. The techniques being employed now were simply not possible even 15 years ago. The ability to develop a usable DNA profile from 0.4 nanograms of genetic material, from evidence preserved for 60 years, is breathtaking. The ability to upload that profile into genealogical databases and then use investigative genealogy to build out family trees, trace distant cousins, follow lines back through generations and forward again until you arrive at a specific name, is a scientific capability that would have seemed like science fiction to the investigators who first worked many of these cases. Parabon Nanolabs, the DNA Doe Project, NCMEC, the FBI's forensic units, and the state and local laboratories that support these investigations are doing work that is fundamentally changing what justice looks like for cold case victims. Cases that were once considered impossible to solve are being cracked with increasing regularity. Patterns that were once indiscernible are becoming visible. Names that were once lost are being recovered. And every single time a name is recovered, a family somewhere gets to exhale, gets to grieve properly, gets to stop living in that terrible suspension between not knowing and knowing. There are still thousands of unidentified victims in databases across the United States. There are still thousands of cold cases sitting in files, waiting for the science to catch up with the evidence. There are still families waiting for a phone call that will change their lives. But cases like these 7 prove that the waiting is not always permanent. That justice, even when it moves with agonizing slowness, can still arrive. That a speck of DNA too small to see, preserved on a piece of clothing for 6 decades, can still speak, can still point to a name, can still bring someone home. A final thought. Ronaldo Rocha, Maricela's brother, said something at that news conference that has stayed with me since I first read it. He talked about how their mother kept saying Maricela's name in her final days. He talked about how much that grief had hurt her, right up until her last breath. And then he said, "We have closure now. We can start the healing process now. Start the healing process." After 4 to 5 years. They are starting now, because they could not truly start before. The grief was there, but so was the not knowing. And the not knowing made the grief impossible to finish. Linda Galpin, Mary Simpson's sister, is 78 years old. She has thought about Mary every single day for 61 years. Every single day. The little girl she used to skate with, the sister she came home to find gone, the memory of that face in the casket that never left her. And now, at 78, she has the name of the man who did it. She has the confirmation. She has the closure she was never supposed to get. Alma Braden said that you keep playing that movie in your head over and over of the last minutes and last seconds of someone's life. And that is true. That is what grief does when it is unresolved. It plays the movie. It imagines. It fills the silence with the worst possible version of events because the silence itself is unbearable. These 7 families are no longer living in that silence. The movie still plays, because grief does not stop. But now they know. Now they have something solid to hold. Now the case files that bore the names of their loved ones say solved instead of open. And after 4 to 5 years, after 61 years, after 33 years, after 4 to 2 years, the word solved is everything. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for sitting with these stories. They matter. These people matter. And the investigators, scientists, genealogists, and families who refuse to give up matter too. Do not forget to like and subscribe if you want to see more stories like these. Comment below and let me know which of these cases hit you the hardest. And share this video because these victims deserve to be remembered by more than just their case numbers. Their names are Maricela, Mary, Sarah, Elizabeth, Patrick, and two more whose stories continue to unfold.